After having finished medical school, met other medical students in my day-to-day work, I see grades as not actually that important.
Peek behind the curtain. I know some dumb doctors.
Oh, dumb.
But
I know some
they're
people,
not bad doctors.
not bad doctors,
No.
no. But there's a lot to be said about what experiences you had before coming into med school that really shapes what kind of doctor you're going to be. And in my honest opinion, I would say at least 50% of the job is actually communication. Kia ora koutou and welcome to Revolving Door Syndrome. I'm Dr. Nina Sue, your friendly neighbourhood paediatric and emergency doctor. My day job is helping sick kids get better. But lately, it's felt like I'm pushing a revolving door round and round in circles. I patch these kids up, send them back to the environment that made them sick in the first place, and they come right back through those hospital doors again. Together with my partner Connor, we have created this podcast to deep dive into the reasons for our broken systems and perhaps find some real solutions. This podcast was made in association with the School of Medicine, University of Auckland. So welcome to the Revolving Door Syndrome. How are you this evening, Rich?
All good.
Good.
How are you?
Good. So Rich is another junior paediatric doctor here in Auckland region, and tonight we're going to talk about Māori health and junior doctor burnout. You were in the year above me at med school, and I kind of want to know about your experience coming through med school as a Māori medical student and now being a Māori junior doctor.
Yeah. Keeping it nice and focused and narrow. It's a bit weird for me growing up because I'm in that kind of half-caste position. I'm half Māori, half Pākehā, and a lot of people don't think I'm Māori when they first look at me, at least before I got my Māoriness carved into my arm. Before then, I was in that weird space of being quite a pale Māori, but I did grow up in Māori tikanga, speaking te reo and English fluently. And then I suppose being Māori did afford me a few opportunities I might not have otherwise had coming into university. So before I even got into uni and med school, I managed to get some work experience with a Māori surgeon, Jeremy Stanley, former rugby player, orthopedic surgeon, really nice guy. And that's what really piqued my interest in coming into medicine. And then just having to meet the required grades. Going through the first year was a bit of a shock for me when you kind of end up coming face to face with some of the not so subtle racism that's out there, particularly from other students trying to get into medical school. It's a very competitive scheme, as you know.
Totally.
And just going back to the thing where some people don't realise I'm Māori when they first start talking to me, and then when they do, and they realise we're competing to get into med school, and they realise that I am Māori and I have a bit of an advantage getting in, you can just see the attitude change. So this one guy, we used to just sit next to each other in lectures, chatting, going through the motions of first year biomed, and then I mentioned that I was a member of MAPAS. Then you just see him double take and just the attitude change completely.
I find that quite interesting that people have that sort of response when people are a MAPAS student or enter med school through the MAPAS system, and yet I don't hear a peep when people talk about things like the rural admission scheme or whatever we call it this day. You know, it's all well and good for people who come from a rural background or even not that rural of a background, because I think recently around the time when I started medical school, the admission scheme had changed. So it was a rural and regional admission scheme or something like that. So where I'm from is Warkworth, which is relatively rural. It's a small town that serves a large rural population, and because it was part of the Auckland region, it was no longer counted as rural. So I was in the general population, yet people who come from places like Palmerston North or Nelson that aren't really that rural got to come in on this rural and regional admission scheme. So it just makes it very odd that people have this big reaction to people having this advantage coming into med school through this MAPA scheme, and yet there's a whole nother cohort of people, and maybe a lot of these people come from rural places, are Caucasian, and no one bats an eye when they get a advantage to come into med school.
No, but and then I suppose it's worth highlighting it's not meant to begrudge them either.
No.
And the animosity comes from people who don't understand the purpose of schemes like this, why it's important to have representation across the board, kind of reflecting the diverse culture in New Zealand that you want to reflect in your medical workforce. I don't know, how did you feel as a rural girl but not qualifying in the eyes of the university?
In terms of the rural admission scheme, I just thought, because I knew people who were just 2 years older than me who were able to get in through the rural admission scheme. I mean, at the end of the day, I still got in through the general. And so it would have potentially been a little bit easier if I'd gone through the rural admission scheme. But I guess I was lucky that I was able to work hard and that I had a lot of support from my family, albeit my mum, quote unquote, never ever thought I would get into medical school. But here I am.
We're all lucky, but you also got to work hard, and that's the same
totally.
for anyone going through any of those schemes as well, is that even though there are dedicated places for Māori Pacific students, rural students, regional students, they still have to meet the standard.
And admittedly, when I came to university as a first year medical student, I didn't have a lot of exposure to people who were Māori in Pacifica. You know, coming from Warkworth, it's a, predominantly white town. I knew what the purpose of like MAPAS and the regional rural admission scheme was. I wasn't necessarily strongly for it, but I wasn't against it. It was just something that I didn't know much about. But having, gone through med school and learned more and more about the inequities in health for Māori in Pacifica and the fact that our workforce doesn't represent our population, I really understood that this is something that's so important.
Yeah.
I look at the workforce right now and I see there's a huge gap in Māori in Pacifica health practitioners.
Did you carry any resentment with you towards anyone
in terms of like people who got in through the MAPAS scheme? No, definitely not.
Anyone in your class who you felt were undeserving?
No, I don't think so, because I think a lot of people, potentially people who don't get into medical school, for example, you read things on Facebook comments and Reddit and all this kind of stuff about people who are like, MAPAS students get it so easy, like they don't have to get very high grades to get in, blah, blah, blah. I got A+ and I didn't get in, etc., etc. On reflection, after having finished medical school, met other medical students in my day-to-day work, I see the work that we do is grades is not actually that important.
Peek behind the curtain, I know some dumb doctors.
Oh, dumb.
But they're not bad doctors.
Not bad doctors, no. But there's a lot to be said about what experiences you had before coming into med school that really shapes what kind of doctor you're going to be. And I think, in my honest opinion, I think grades and book smarts is only 50% of the job. I would say at least 50% of the job is actually communication and critical thinking. Right? And
the things you get grades for, science and clinical knowledge and clinical skills, barring communication, those are things you can learn. Those are things that are easy to learn, but things that are harder to adjust and learn, will change. It's like your personality, the way you talk to people, and the way you can relate to them.
Totally. And if you're a Caucasian New Zealand European person, and you can't change that about you, and just like I can't change the fact that I'm Asian, but it does mean that if I have an Asian patient, specifically Chinese patient, then I probably will be able to relate to them better than you or some other Caucasian doctor. That's just facts, and you can't really change it about them.
And it's more based on life experience as opposed to anything that you're doing right or doing wrong. It's just that you can relate to them and they feel that they can relate to you. You can be the smartest doctor in the world and know every single drug, every single treatment plan, but if you can't communicate with your patient, then what's the point?
Totally. And if you can't get the patient on your side, how are they going to take the medicine you prescribe them?
Yeah.
Where did you come from? Where'd you grow up?
I grew up out in West Auckland in a little town called Ranui. People who are from Auckland probably familiar, but have probably never been. And it's probably a place that they would drive through quickly.
On the way to where?
On the way out to Piha or out to the golf course in Swanson or something like that. Very deprived area, decile 1, decile 2. I was lucky to have a pretty stable household growing up, and I'm eternally thankful for that, because I think I owe everything that I've achieved so far in my life to mum and dad, absolutely. And the same can't be said, for example, my neighbours' kids whose house got raided for a meth lab when I was about 5, or the kids in the caravan park up the road who would come to school covered in sores and just obvious signs of poverty. So yeah, I grew up out there and spent the first 20-something years of my life there, and I'm glad to have made it out. But mum and dad are still there, still go visit them. Can be a nice place, but also can be a dangerous place. Got to be realistic about it. Yeah, that's where I grew up, but my family is from Te Araroa on the East Cape. That's where dad's from, and then they all moved up to Auckland, him and his however many siblings, I keep losing track of how many aunties and uncles I have. Classic Māori problem. And
Same. I mean, I've got a bunch of auntie and uncles and I don't know what their names are.
if I go to the coast and I meet a Māori fella, they'll be like, this is your auntie. I'm like, of course it is. I'll just believe you. But, mum and dad met out west in Te Aratu and then raised me up in Rānui. So through and through Westie. Take me out of the west, can't take the west out of me.
So it's interesting. A lot of people believe in meritocracy, right? That like you work, that the harder you work, the better you get in life. And if you're doing well in life, it's because you worked hard and you deserved it. But we talk about this whole thing, like I was saying, I'm lucky. Yeah. We talk about how we're lucky that we grew up in the families that we grew up in. My parents were immigrants that came only a couple of years before I was born. So the upbringing that I had early on in my life was very, like, my parents were very working class when I was growing up, when I was little. But, my parents worked very hard and they were able to have climb socially. And I had a very middle class upbringing, probably from around the age of high school at least. So I'm very lucky that my parents had a very good grasp on how to provide a good, warm, safe home and encourage me with extracurricular activities and education and all that. And I never went without anything, but my parents weren't wealthy when I was growing up. And that can't be said for like lots of other people.
No.
And people talk about, if you work really hard, you'll get there. But the fact is that different people are born with different situations and some people get more when they're born, right?
Yeah.
And so I just know that if I didn't have my parents' support, and they helped me a lot financially in the first year of medicine so that I could just focus on trying to get into medicine, because I couldn't really live at home and study at the same time. And if I didn't have that, probably I wouldn't have got into med school.
No. The other thing to say is people do work hard. They do earn things and they should feel proud of that.
Yeah.
But it is recognising the base, and not everyone has the same kind of base that they've come from. Likewise, my parents could never have afforded med school at all, not in a million years. As soon as I graduated, I was already making more than my dad, who has worked for nearly 40 years at his current job. And, they spent what money they had just trying to push me through school and give me what I needed to be successful. And like I said, I'm very grateful for that. And at the same time, I still did work hard. And I don't feel bad towards anyone who had a bit of a leg up in life, because I went to school out west in Rānui Primary, represent. I don't think they've ever had a doctor come out of that school before. Then I snuck my way into the back door at Mount Albert Grammar, which is a big central school. And by gosh, I have never seen so many white people in my life. Growing up out west in Rānui, and I'm the whitest guy in the school.
Oh, really?
I speak fluent Māori, and we had one Asian dude who, really nice guy, very good at maths, but I'd never seen any other Asian besides him. I'd never seen as big a collection of white people as when I went to school at Mount Albert Grammar. It was a bit of a change for me because I just grew up around Māoris and Pacific Islanders. And then making friends with these guys, friends with their families, but then getting to see the life that they lived growing up compared to me. And I wasn't like bitter or anything about it. I was like, yo, this is cool. I go around to their houses and it's like 5 stories, and
it's nice to have friends with nice places, right?
You got a pool, bro? Yo, hook us up.
Sleepover.
It's not something that I ever felt like I was missing, because
Totally.
I wasn't missing it. It's nothing I was happy with what I had, and I often felt at times I'd be ungrateful to my parents for what they gave me. Yeah, it is true that privilege is real. And a lot of people don't realise, once they've become successful at something, what help they had along the way. Because I firmly believe no one ever achieves anything by themselves. There's always help along the way, whether it's family, friends, significant others, or organisations. And yes, hard work's important, but also just being cognizant that you had help.
Yeah.
And appreciating that.
And as a parent, there's absolutely nothing wrong with trying to do everything you can to help your
Absolutely
parent,
not.
Right?
And that's why
help your children.
Can't fault them, but I suppose there's nothing more annoying to me in this world than people who don't acknowledge what they have.
Yeah, and it's not about being ashamed, getting somewhere because of help,
thankful.
But just be thankful and recognise that maybe other people had it harder to get there.
And it's not like it's like a tick box of privilege and not privilege. It's a scale. I'm
totally
privileged compared to some others and disadvantaged compared to others as well. I feel like I'm able to acknowledge that, and that I do feel lucky for what I have been given and proud of what I've achieved with that as well.
growing up in Ranui, how did you end up speaking fluently in Māori? Like, it was just through your family or through school?
So I never realised my dad could speak Māori until I was about 21 at my cousin's wedding, and he stood up and did a big full-on mihi, and then I looked at him like, where the fuck have you been hiding that for my whole life? Because I was schooled in, as I said, Ranui Primary. Whakatipu Kākano was the name of the unit, and it was a bilingual unit. So I grew up, English is my first language, that's what we spoke around the house. Dad would say the occasional Māori words at me, hoha, because I'm being annoying, or boy. That's not a Māori word, but feels like it is, because all my uncles call their sons boy. Māori was spoken in our household, but not in a conversational way. But then when I went to school, I started learning Māori and English at the same time, and you do everything in both languages. And then from there, after I finished primary school, I went to Kōwhai Intermediate, which is also a central school, but I went into their total immersion unit. That was Te Whānau Pounamu. That was different. That was a huge change for me, because we did everything in Te Reo Māori, and everything except English, which sometimes felt like an optional subject at that school, which is a mainstream school, but they had 3 classes that were just fully immersed in Māori. So for 2 years, all I spoke was Māori at school, and I maintain to this day that there has not been a harder subject, even throughout med school and paediatric training. There's not been anything harder than doing algebra in Te Reo Māori, particularly when your alphabet doesn't have the letter X.
Look, I don't even remember how to do algebra in English, to be honest.
Yeah, we don't need algebra anymore, do we? Yeah, the other thing that's worth saying is not a lot of Māori people do speak Māori, like at least fluently. It is making a resurgence, which is really good, but even still, the majority of the adult Māori population can't speak Te Reo Māori, but that does not lessen their own kind of mana or wairua. To me, what's more important is what I call growing up Māori, and that's growing up around your family, learning Māori tikanga, the Māori way of life. I grew up doing kapahaka. You could always pick me out on stage because I was the whitest dude up there. My chest was just like glowing like a beacon compared to everyone else. But it's like what we were talking about before with like life experiences. That's what kind of builds that foundation for understanding and building those relationships with people, and now in my current job with patients, being able to acknowledge their own experiences, the things that happened to them when they grew up, their own relationship with Te Ao Māori, and compare it to yours. And I feel one of the things that the university teaches you that I could never really get behind is it's such an artificial way, the way they teach us on how to engage with Māori patients. You probably remember from med school when they have like the communication lessons and introduce yourself, say your pepeha and ask them where they're from. And I find that such a weird thing. If someone came up to me and said, my mountain is Mount Albert, it's important, but I feel like the university pushes it so hard in a way that it becomes unnatural. And it
feels a little bit tokenistic.
It does. And no, not every single Māori person will know their pepeha and their whakapapa, and that's not as important to them.
How would you, if you could change the way that communication with Māori patients is taught in medical school, how would you change it?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I really don't. Because I'm trying to think of the ways I learnt all these things. And it's not something that was a lesson, like a formal lesson at least. It's just things I picked up. And how do you tell someone to talk to? How do you tell someone to make friends with someone? Like, there's not a recipe. It's not a speech you can say. The things that we're taught in med school or even primary school, high school, if you grew up in New Zealand, about mihi and pepeha, those are very formal things. Those are things you do on the paipai, at the marae, at a tangi or at a pōwhiri, that kind of thing. It's not everyday talk, at least not amongst modern Māori. I suppose it's just applying what communication skills you already know and have, and just trying to relate to someone who comes from a different place than you, not necessarily a Māori person. There are things that are very important to Māori in general, and not being very generalised here, but things like family, things like hokainga or where they're from. Those things are important. This whole thing about hapu, iwi, marae, some Māori don't know those things. Some Māori don't know their iwi or hapu, or even how to talk to them.
And I can imagine that for some Māori people who are probably a bit more detached from their whakapapa and their iwi, or maybe, like you say, they don't even know their iwi.
Yeah,
it can
absolutely.
almost bring about a sense of shame as well in some of these people if you ask them
and you can
they don't
alienate
know.
them.
Exactly.
And put up a wall in between you and them, make it harder to get what you need to know. You probably won't have that trouble with someone from the rural areas. They're hearty people, but particularly the urban city Māori, life's different up here compared to out in the WOPs. I feel like these days, at least when I was growing up and going through my childhood and adolescence, a lot of modern Māori culture is now being really heavily influenced by American black culture, or African American culture, I should say. And I think it's just they feel like they can relate to these people who have been marginalised and feel oppressed. And you see a lot of that, particularly in urban Māori youth. Yeah.
And I just want to bring it back to your dad. So you're saying that you didn't realise that your dad spoke Māori until you were, in your early 20s.
I knew he could say words, but I didn't realise he could do a whole bloody speech. That was a real shock to me.
Why do you think you didn't know that until you were 21? Like, why do you think he didn't make it known that he would speak that well?
Me and my dad have a interesting relationship, a really good relationship. He's a really good mate of mine. But I suppose that it's just not one of the things we really talked about much growing up, at least not because we grew up in Auckland. But whenever we go back home, he kind of somehow shifts and becomes a bit more Māori. And when I say home, back to Te Aroha on the East Cape, because that's where he grew up. He grew up there until he was, I think, early teenager. And if you want a picture of the place, just think of a farm, river, mountain, and a small town with a convenience store, a police station, and a pub. I say police station, it's a hut. I say a pub, it's a room. The cop there is as likely to pull you over for smoking marijuana as to smoke it with you. Yeah, good town. It is a beautiful town. It's a lot of Dutch there for some reason. They like to travel there because you can walk around the point. It's the easternmost part of New Zealand, and if you don't count Chatham Islands, and no one does. And first place in the country to see the sunrise. That's why it's called Te Tai Rāwhiti, which means the shining sun. But yeah, he grew up rural and Māori, and his mother was a Māori teacher. So honestly, I don't know why I thought he could never speak Māori, because he probably could. I don't know, just ended up being a bit of a shock. Because growing up, to me, he was not only my dad, he was also like my rugby coach, my softball coach. All we'd talk about is sports and school and what he does at work and stuff like that, and what he'd get me to help him with, because he's an electrician by trade. And when I was younger, he'd take me along to jobs and shove me in the roof of a house so I could run a wire for him, that kind of thing. But we never really got talking about that kind of stuff. So it was a surprise, but a pleasant one. Yeah.
Do you guys ever talk about the experience of being Māori?
Not really. So a thing happened about 5 years ago. I was out with my dad, and we were at a kind of a public event, and he got accused of doing something very bad, very bad. He was innocent, obviously, but we ended up having to go through a whole court process, and I wrote a supporting statement and things for him, and he was eventually found innocent of all charges. But I remember sitting down with the lawyer and reading the statement that the accuser wrote about my dad, and I've never been so angry.
That sounds really frustrating.
Just because of the way he described my father and how blatantly racist it was, and how he described him as a very, scruffy, disgusting looking man who did not look like he belonged at this event. He had no idea of what he was doing there. And, talking to the lawyer afterwards, she said that there was no doubt that this was taken so far and that the police did nothing to help. We had to do all the kind of evidence looking for ourselves, but there was no doubt impacted by the colour of his skin. And I've never seen my dad cry. The only time was when his mother died. But just seeing how that kind of thing impacted him, because he's a wonderful man.
He raised you.
But it was a real eye-opener for me, just getting a glimpse into this person's mind and how they immediately made these assumptions about him.
Because that's the thing, isn't it? It's not only if people were falsely accusing your dad. It's the evidence shows is that, Māori people who are accused of the same crime as a non-Māori is that they're much more likely to be found guilty of something.
Yeah.
And not only that, as if they're found guilty, they have much longer sentences and are much more likely to be incarcerated.
Absolutely.
So all of the things are against you, right?
Yeah, and I know little to nothing about legal proceedings and all these kind of things, but you always hear that thing of innocent until found guilty.
Totally.
That wasn't what it felt like at all. Especially when we were the ones who had to go asking the arena for the security tapes and all that kind of stuff, just to prove that he hadn't done something. You know, I've experienced that kind of thing myself, where particularly with the police, don't have a good working relationship with them. Maybe it's because of the car I drive. It's a Mazda Demio from the 90s.
Fits the description, does it?
Yeah, Māori male driving a blue Mazda Demio, dent in the back, suspected stolen. But being pulled over one time, hadn't done anything at all, wasn't speeding, was wearing my seatbelt, had my full license. Officer, why'd you pull me over? Oh, because you look like one of our usuals. Just quite blatantly. And I was just gobsmacked. Oh. So, checked my stuff, let me go.
That's crazy.
And that's not the only time something like that's happened. One time when I was on my way to a night shift at hospital, get pulled over, same car, Mazda Demio. Was wearing a singlet, so my tattooed arm was out the window. Maybe I shouldn't do that in the future. Policeman pulls up on his bike next to me, looks at me, goes back behind, flashes, pulls me over. And then he, gets out of the car. He's like, "Hey, bro, what are you doing tonight?" I'm like, "I'm on my way to work." "Oh, what do you do?" "I'm a doctor," and I show him my ID. And he's like, "From there, it's no longer bro, it's sorry, sir. I'll let you go on your way." "Why'd you pull me over?" "Oh, there was a ram raid up the road and we saw your car driving away from it." I'm like, "Oh, does my car look like it's been in a ram raid?" It's only the back that's dented, by the way, unless I reversed into the shop
A reverse
front.
raid?
Yeah. And that's only 2 of the several times I've been pulled over for nothing.
I'm sorry that's happened to you, but I'm also unfortunately not surprised,
It's a small thing. Nothing happened in the end, but it's not that small a thing to me.
For me, I don't think I've ever even been pulled over by
Really?
the police. Yeah.
Ride with me sometime.
Me, as an Asian woman, I have never had an accident or anything like that. But, it's that whole stereotyping thing, right? For example, if I make a small mistake or something when I'm driving and nothing bad happens, me as a clearly outwardly Asian female, I get this feeling of shame. Oh my gosh, I have once again let down my entire demographic, because once again there's gonna be another driver who's these freaking Asian female drivers.
You're conforming to the stereotype.
Exactly.
Be better.
Oh, they're all so bad at driving.
Not your future. It's like, when I'm driving my car, it's probably not stolen.
What about going through med school as well? Did you notice any racism towards you as a Māori medical student?
Honestly, not a lot. At least not from our cohort. Like from my colleagues, well, my former classmates, now colleagues. I suppose I feel like that first year in particular, the competition brings out the worst in people. I think for some people it's not even to be a doctor, it's to show that they can do the hardest thing and be the most successful, which is the wrong reason to go into medicine. But once you get in, you'll often find that the right people got in, and that's not to say some people who are deserving missed out, absolutely, but the ones who got in by far and large are very much deserving to be there. They appreciate everyone, their classmates, regardless of their kind of background, their race, their upbringing, their ideologies, that kind of thing. So no, I had a pretty good relationship with the vast majority of my classmates. I can't think of anyone I dislike. But when I became a doctor,
here we go. Here's the tea.
Oh yeah, there was this one time when I was a registrar doing a clinic with a family, and I had a student in with me. And doing my thing, listening to the child's chest, made a plan, sent them on their way. They seemed happy. They were polite throughout. Thought it went fine. And then when the door closed, my student turned to me and she told me that as I was listening to the child's chest, the mother saw my tattoo on my arm. So for people listening, I have a full kind of tāmoko. It goes from my shoulder down to my elbow and circumferential as well. So it's pretty full on. And that was a personal choice for me, not making a statement or anything like that. It has a personal meaning to me. Absolutely. My body, my choice. There's a topic. Anyway, so my student said to me that while I was listening to the patient's chest, the mother noticed my tattoo. And she turned to my student with a bit of a cheeky grin in her eyes, like, "Oh, is he Māori?" I'm like, and my student was, "Yes." "Oh, is he gonna start stamping his feet, yelling and screaming at us?" And I didn't hear any of this. My student didn't say anything to that, bless her. And then when she told me this, I laughed. And then I realised, that's really racist.
Yeah.
That's really
unnecessary, bad. Yeah.
So then I went out of the room and stamped my feet and did a haka. No. And it just makes me wonder what other people are thinking when they see me in a relatively senior role, depending on the context. What other thoughts are going through their heads? Yeah, that was a not so nice experience. I don't know, have you had any bad experiences being an Asian doctor?
I haven't had any particularly myself. I felt that during at least the beginning times of the COVID pandemic, I was gearing up for it because I was hearing stories from other people, other doctors or nurses in New Zealand and around the country, around the world, who had experiences of people being like, "Oh, I don't want an Asian doctor, or I don't want a Chinese doctor," regardless of what kind of Asian people were. I don't want a Chinese doctor, or I don't want a Chinese nurse. I don't want the plague, COVID, all that kind of stuff. Luckily for me, that didn't happen. I think if somebody did say that, I probably would have been like, fine.
Yeah. You'd sick your pet bats on them, wouldn't you?
What's that?
Sick your pet bats on them.
Yeah, I just... I'd be like, that's fine. I don't want to work anyway. See ya.
Yeah. I had an interesting one the other day in ED where a mother came in and she has 2 daughters and one of them is adopted. And she has a daughter who is fair-skinned and red hair. And then her adopted daughter is Māori and very much looks Māori. Brown skin, brown eyes, brown hair. And she, without any prompting whatsoever from me, said to me, I noticed a difference in care that my Māori child receives. My fair-skinned child is much more likely to be referred through to a specialist, be referred through to hospital, whereas my Māori child is, when I go to the GP, we're given a spacer and sent home even though she's much more sick. Because I'd never heard anyone, even though we all taught about Māori health inequities and implicit bias and institutionalised racism, I've never actually heard a patient verbalise it. And that was just like, whoa, that's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how long ago all this education about institutional racism and Māori health and stuff started in medical school. I think for me, I have to realise that actually some of the people who are doctors who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, whatever, they didn't have that same education that we did. So I have to recognise that they have some catching up to do. But it should be well known now that in terms of Māori health inequities, that Māori on average do have worse health at every age and
every single age.
Every single age and at every level of deprivation.
But we're less likely to get multiple sclerosis. So suck on that.
And to recognise that the worst Māori health outcomes, people should be like, well, actually, maybe we should be having more treatments for Māori, but instead, for some reason, the inverse happens, and I just don't understand it.
Well, Māori patients are less likely to have investigations ordered. They're less likely to be referred through to secondary care, to specialist care, compared to non-Māori patients with the same presenting complaint. And I don't see how that's justifiable. And I'd hope that people aren't making conscious decisions to make that gap happen or make that thing be a thing, and that it is something that they don't realise is happening. But it's astounding. And then you get people throwing their toys when you suggest reasons or ways of improving it. And that's why we have certain schemes and why there's so much emphasis on providing access and care to disadvantaged people.
In your opinion, how do you think we should change things to treat the inequities for Māori health?
I think a lot of it comes down to access. And that's not just for Māori health, it's the deprived, the impoverished,
impoverished is anyone who's impoverished, right? Like you don't have to be Māori to benefit from these sorts of things. It's for everyone.
It just so happens that the most impoverished tend to be Māori and Pacific, tend to be out in South and West Auckland. And that's why we should be aiming to increase access to medical care, primary care, interventions and screening programs, all that kind of stuff, and why money should be put into these areas so we achieve better health outcomes for everyone. Is that, if you've ever seen that nice cartoon and explaining the difference between equality and inequity of 3 people standing behind a fence trying to watch a game, you got their different heights, you got a young child, a teenager and an adult, and if you all give them the same block to stand under, the adult can see over the fence, the teenager can just maybe see the top of the fence, but the child can't see under the fence. But if you give the child a bigger thing, he can see over the fence. You give the teenager a slightly bigger stool, he can also see over the fence, and the adult doesn't need quite as much help. That's always been one of my favourite kind of cartoons. I remember Paparangi Reid, in one of her first year lectures, there was a slide, and that image always stuck with me.
Totally, because that's that whole thing that we've seen evidence again and again, that all these one-size-fits-all interventions, they don't treat the inequities. In fact, some of them make them worse. One of the things that we have in place was like free GP visits for under 13 or under 14 or something, which is great. So that's great that children like under that age group get free GP visits. But the people that it probably benefits most is still the people who could have afforded to take their kids to see the GP in the first place.
Yeah.
Because having chats with other people, I realised that actually if families go to a GP practice, and obviously the parents, if they go to see the GP, they have to pay. But if they've racked up a bill at this GP practice, sometimes they don't feel comfortable bringing their children, even though the children will be free, because they might, be asked about this bill that they haven't paid.
Yeah.
And so that's another barrier to access.
Yeah. And then while we're touching on GP practices, there's been a shift in the primary healthcare model, a particular primary health organisation.
Do you mean East Tamaki Healthcare
how did you know?
the local doctors?
Yeah, where it's gone away from a family-centred care approach to a walk-in, see any random GP, which I think is the worst way.
Oh, the worst, absolutely.
A continuity of care for a family. When I grew up, my GP was Dr. Christopher Smith, and he was awesome, and I knew him from birth. He delivered me, and I knew him heading well into my medical career as well, and he was the only doctor I ever saw growing up, and he knew me, and I felt that we had a relationship. And it's just now when you go and see the GP, it's someone you've never met before. They have to go through your file, and then you get surprised.
But that only depends on where your GP is and who your GP is. Because
but then we get surprised why people just forego going to the GP because it still costs money, and it floods the emergency departments with things that probably don't need to be seen in an emergency department.
Totally. And I'm working at Kids First Middlemore Hospital, and that's what we're seeing is that there are a lot of children who are unwell being brought to the emergency department who are unwell but don't actually need emergency care, but their family can't get in to see their GP, or for other reasons can't bring their kid to the GP practice in the times that they are open, or they aren't getting good quality of care. And I take issue with some of the way that they've organised their primary care, because like you say, there's no continuity of care. So sometimes I'm getting children who have very complex health needs who, because of poverty, their whole family is enrolled in these practices. But they're getting tired of having to explain all of the health conditions every time they see a new person. And I'm like, totally. That's not acceptable for a child who's got 8 different things going on and 7 different regular medications.
I mean, in the States, general practice is known as family medicine. They're family doctors, and that's what I think they should be. And it seems like today the model's really shifted more towards let's see as many patients as we can, make money type approach, which is definitely the wrong way to be headed.
And some other things is I've heard that children are having to be seen by their GP before they're allowed to get their routine immunisations.
Oh, yeah.
And there's absolutely no evidence base or guideline from a paediatric point of view that's standard of care. And because of these practices that aren't allowing appointments, these families would have to wait for hours in their waiting room before their child is able to be seen by the GP to have the okay for an immunisation. And these families don't want to do that. And I'm like, that's fair enough. We're in COVID times and you don't want to be in a waiting room full of people coughing, right?
And the families who struggle to get into the GP anyway often have other things on their mind, like their 3 jobs that they're working. They don't have time to spend waiting
for
GP
3 hours.
Practice.
And I brought up this concern with old mate David Seymour, who is my local MP.
Davo.
And I asked him, have you heard of East Tamaki Healthcare or the local doctors? And he said no. And do you know why he hasn't heard of them? Because they don't put their practices in places like Parnell, Epsom, Remuera. They put their practices in place like Glen Innes, Papakura,
Ranui Medical Centre.
all of those places heavily concentrated in areas that are heavily impoverished.
It's a shame. It's a real shame.
Yeah, because primary care is where we could have the best bang for our buck.
Absolutely. Because if you can stop them getting to hospital, then you're already fixing so many problems.
Totally.
Yeah.
So, one last final question is, what dinosaur is your favourite and why?
Do you know the ones with like the rock heads, the pachycephalosaurs?
I think so.
Yeah. Just, really reflects my approach to life. Just run at it with your fucking head. That's a good move.
I love that.
That's a good one.
Inspirational.
Yeah. I do aim to inspire.
All right. Thanks, Rich.
All
Have a
good.
good night.
Thanks, Nina.
Revolving Door Syndrome pays respects to elders past and present. We acknowledge Māori as tangata whenua and Te Tiriti o Waitangi partners in Aotearoa, New Zealand.